Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about adversarial product management. This is, here I am. So if you need my email address or my Twitter handle, this is it. But as she was saying, as Yolas was saying, I have about 20 years of experience in product management and then dabbled in the dark arts of business development as well. But don't hold that against me. I think they're actually very similar to each other in a lot of ways, and we can talk about that afterwards. But I think the key thing and the reason why we're all here is that you're all wrong in some way. You just don't know how, you don't know when, but you are always wrong. In some little way, in some way that in the back of the head, you know there's a problem with the way you think today. And from my perspective, adversarial mindsets really help us get at why we're wrong and help us get a little bit less wrong as time goes on. So I want to take a key example, which is project estimation, right? And this is something that I think, how many people have actually done more project D management type of stuff here? Not many, okay. So very pure product managers in here. But I think the key problem about product estimation is that there's a lot of different biases that are at play when we start to think about why or how we do estimation. And this is a metric from HBR, which talks to the fact that, on average, projects go over budget by about 27%, right? And that, on average, 1 in 6 of these projects will see a project overrun of over 200%. And so these are real issues, right? We do our best to try to estimate things as well as possible as a team, trying to decide what to build, but we're still wrong in some way. We still, in some way, don't do the right job when it comes to estimation. And so there's a bunch of reasons why we actually are wrong, and so I'm going to go through a few of them right now. So the first is biases. If people are familiar with biases, these are things that have been very popular recently. This is a great infographic of about 130 different biases, cognitive biases that are documented on Wikipedia. The reason why they exist is because we have evolved over time to use these biases to help us out in the wild to not get eaten by lions. But in the end, when we talk about the world that we live in today, it doesn't help us so much. And in the book Thinking Fast and Slow, which has anybody read this book in here? Okay, everybody's read this book. The idea of type 1 and type 2 thinking, or which is now referred to rather than system 1 and 2, is really this idea that, again, we're doing things very quickly with very little mental overhead, and that's our type 1 thinking. But then type 2 thinking is when we slow down and we try to understand things at a deeper level. The problem is that both of those systems have biases in some way. Some of them are towards how do we do faster processing, other ones are how do we do a better job of matching the reality of our internal reality of the world. And so maybe the most insidious bias out of all of them is what's referred to as the blind spot bias. And so this is a report that talks about this, an academic report. And so people are often unaware of their own biases, even though they can readily spot the same biases in the judgments of others, right? So we don't even know when we are actually being biased. And that's a really big problem. The next thing is assumptions. So assumptions, what I mean by that are the assumptions that we all have as an organization about the way the world works. And this is a really important paper from actually 1986. It was by Prahlad and Bettis. And what this talks about when we refer to dominant logic is that people, when they form a business of some type or an organization, they start to build a cognitive map that really helps them survive in that particular context. Once those people are successful, though, they start to expand either the products that they're building, the customers they're serving, the problems that they're solving, and they try to apply the same mindsets in that larger context. And that causes failure a lot of the time. And this is a more recent work by Rich Bettis and a few other people that I think is really important. So dominant logic biases knowledge. It does that to know-how and skill accumulation into path-dependent pathways preferred by the dominant logic. That means that the people that are in the management level of the business, they've built this cognitive map, and then they filter everything that they hear or see through that cognitive map. And then finally, in this manner, variance and exploration of alternatives are suppressed, right? So anything that doesn't fit into that cognitive map doesn't make any sense to the organization. And that's why when you see things like the innovator's dilemma, that's a symptom of this type of problem. The next thing is certainty. This is a really great book about certainty in general. And what I think is really interesting about this is the idea that when you put people into basically a MCAT machine or a scanning machine for your brain, basically the same part of your brain that lights up with emotion is the part that actually will light up when you feel certain about something. And so certainty is not something that you get to through logical inference. It's not something that you carefully articulate and think about, but it's something you feel. And they can show this with people that have mental disorders where they feel something is so true, but it actually isn't, no matter how much evidence is given to them. And so Robert Burton, who wrote the book, talks about this. Feeling correct or certain isn't a deliberate conclusion or conscious choice. It's a mental sensation that happens to us. And so even when we think we're right, we're possibly not. It's not something that we pull together by looking at the actual logical, causal reasons that we're pulling up in our brain. The next thing is lack of diversity, right? This is a really great article in HBR that talks about how teams that are diverse in some way also perform better. And in particular, on a homogeneous team, people readily understand each other and the collaboration flows smoothly, giving a sensation of progress. But you still suffer from the same type of thing as the assumptions in the previous example. You have a common frame of reference, you have a common set of understandings. And so that means you think about things very similarly, and you can't think outside of those things. And so adding an outsider versus an insider actually doubled their chance of arriving at the correct answer. So even when it comes to things where there is an answer, if we're all more like each other, we're going to in some way not pick the right answer. And then finally, we live in a world that has an uncertain future, right? We live in a complex world today, whereas previously we lived in villages that were 150 people, which is the Dunbar number about, and then moved into a world today where 3 billion people are online and that we can interact with any of those 3 billion people pretty easily. And so that uncertain future actually harkens back to something within machine learning and the idea of decision science in general. And so this is one of two equations that will be in this entire talk, and I promise you will not do more than that. But total error in a decision-making process is broken down into 3 components usually, and this is for machine learning. That its bias is a really, really big problem. Variance is the second biggest problem, and then noise, which is usually referred to as irreducible error. And so I guess what I'm saying is that when we talk about bias, that's how we understand or generalize the world, and that's really the bias aspect of this. But variance is that how wide of a possibility does this model's data actually hold? And so what I would argue is that part of the problem here is that we're not taking into account variance in the way that we should in our decision-making processes. And so this is another person, Gegerziner, he was part of the Max Planck Institute out of Germany. And we talk a lot about this idea of heuristics. And one of the things that he said that was really, I guess, struck me, and the reason why I include this equation is that the more uncertain the criterion is, or the smaller sample size available, the more cognitive system needs to protect itself from one kind of error, variance, over the other, bias. And so what is like in our world that has small sample size and uncertainty? That's basically the way that we make decisions on our daily lives. We can't go back and change the way we made a decision and test out 4 different options. We can do A/B testing, but that time has gone past. So all I'd say is that uncertainty in the world of uncertainty is a real issue that we have to struggle with as product people. So what can we do about any of this? I love this quote that is probably supposed to be from Mark Twain, but it's the idea of, everybody talks about the weather, but no one does anything about it. I think every talk I've seen about biases, they list off 20 or 30 biases, they talk about what they mean, and then that's it. Basically, the concept of you understanding the biases is supposed to make everything better. And this comes from a site that talks about bias, and the way that you get past bias, it's very simple. It's just these steps. A bias is triggered, you develop an awareness of the bias, and then I usually get caught up on that step. Because how are you supposed to do that? We've just shown that from a blind spot standpoint, we don't know when we're being biased. So how do we get out of that, right? Like how do we move past that? And even, Kahneman, this is a great interview with him on Farnham Street that just came out, I think, about a month ago. And he said himself, it's really hard to change other people's behavior. It's very hard to change your own. It's not simple. Right? So even the person who has done all of this amazing work, which some of it is not actually reproducible, but that's a big issue with all of these types of things in psychological studies. Even the person who's the expert in this knows that it's incredibly hard to move past these types of biases. And so I guess what this brought me to is that we need to actually stand outside of our current mindsets in some way. And what that means to me is that because we're trapped by these biases, how do we do this? And I guess, it made me think about who does actually take advantage of mindsets to their game. And a lot of the time when we talk about the history of this, and I'm not going to go in very, very deep on this, but it really is adversaries. right? Adversaries want to understand you to be able to take advantage over whatever your current understanding of the world is. That's basically their job, right? That's why they're your adversary. If they didn't care, they wouldn't know about you. They wouldn't study you, and they wouldn't try to, in some way, subvert the things that you're trying to do. And so, from my perspective, you know, I guess adversarial models are something that I've been researching the last couple years, and I've started to pull them into a couple different mindsets. But what I think is most important is that it's not just about us, though, right? Like, product people exist within a team. And so, this is a very fancy pyramid graphic that I'm trying out. But the fact is that our adversaries are not just ourself, right? But it's also our team and how we are adversarial to them in some way, but also the customer and the way that they understand what they need. And then finally, the universe, right? The world at large is something that we also need to be adversarial to. And some people may ask, why am I not including competitors in here? Is because I don't think that actually matters as much nowadays. Like, it's very rare that you have an explicit case like Lyft versus Uber, right? Most of the time, the biggest problem is that people don't care about what you're building, right? And the reason why they don't care is because you're not actually building something that matters to them in some way. So these are the different types of kind of adversarial models that we're going to talk about during today's presentation. We'll do some workshops that focus on that. And then also I want to make a distinction here too, is that there's two different things that I'm going to talk about. One is mindsets and the other is methods. So mindsets are something that are kind of like a heuristic or a rule that if you take that, you can apply to a lot of different practices, but it's more of a meta rule, right? It's something, the way you should think about things, the way you should consider things rather than you know, a specific action to take. And then methods, these are these exercises that I hope once you try out a few of them today and the things I'll talk about, I'll talk about how to do them. Those are things that you can actually apply to your day-to-day, right? So I don't want you to walk away from here where I'm just saying biases are bad, assumptions are bad, go figure it out yourself. I want to tell you where I've actually built processes and mindsets that help me get out of these things. And a lot of this is going to come from my time at a design consultancy, working for Waze, which I think, you know, again, we were just talking about it earlier today, but that was probably the first time I really saw adversarial models was through an Israeli company, if anybody's worked with Israelis before. So anyways, getting on, adversarial mindsets for the self. So the first mindset I want to talk about is the opposite. And this is something that is pretty easy to apply, and I use an awful lot whenever I start thinking about how I ask people questions, how do I consider what I should be concerned about. So let's talk about it this way. Whenever we as product people are interested in getting something done, we want to do the good way, right? We want to do it the way that we consider to be best in some way. And we don't want to do it in some way the bad way, right? And so a lot of the time when we start to consider this mindset is that, of course, I'm going to do the good things, and the opposite of that is probably the bad, right? It's not always exactly the same thing. So for example, is right there bad? Well, the issue is that we didn't actually see the real edge of the decision-making boundaries in this particular case. And let me give you an example here. So when you use your values as a starting point, when I say bad or the opposite in this case, if I were to tell you something like, if I were to ask you, for example, what is a bad idea, right? It would take whatever values you have, which are incredibly complex. It could be many different values. It could be many different things that you've balled up into what is good right now. And I'm going to ask you to now make the assumption that you have to think about what is bad. And that opposite actually gives you a very clear idea in some ways about where that edge of good and bad is. So that's something I use a lot. And actually, let's do that right now. Okay? So I'm not going to have you open up any tools or anything like that. I want you to sit there for a second. And what I want you to think about is what is a bad idea for running a great meetup? So what's a bad idea? Like, what would be a bad way to run a meetup? And think about that for just 1 minute so I can drink some water. What would be a bad way to run a good meetup or a great meetup? All right, what are some thoughts? Yeah?
Don't advertise it.
Don't advertise it. I mean, that sounds like a bad idea on the face, right? But what if you have a secret society? What if you want exclusivity, right? I mean, that is a bad idea. It's a very bad one when it comes to just regular meetups. But for certain meetups, maybe secrecy is really important. Like, you know, anyways, yeah.
Email everyone on the meetup in the same email.
Email everybody in the same in the meetup in the same email. But it could also start a great discussion.
Don't give directions to the place.
Don't give directions to the place unless it's some type of scavenger hunt, right? What else?
Not having a purpose for the meetup itself.
Not having a purpose for the meetups itself. I mean, that's very true. Although I've found, like, I don't know if people are familiar with like lean coffees, but lean coffees don't have a purpose other than a framing, basically, right? Yeah.
Charge big fees to attend.
Charge big fees to attend, right? Unless you really just want to talk to rich people, basically, right? Or people that are getting corporate sponsorship. Yeah. What else? I mean, so I guess all I'm saying here, right, is that all these bad ideas, in some way, they had like a glimmer of a good idea in there, right? They were things that, yes, maybe on their face, in some ways, they are bad ideas. And I would say that whenever I do this type of exercise where we take the opposite of things, 50% of the time, they really are garbage ideas, okay? I'm not going to lie to you. But the other 50% of the time, you end up understanding something a little bit better about what really matters to you about the thing you're trying to do. So that's the opposite, right? That's a pretty simple mindset to think about. The next one is to adjust uncertainty and to really embrace it in some way. And I think what's interesting about uncertainty in itself is that product people, we are meant to actually deal with uncertainty. That is our entire role on this earth. Everybody else's role is slightly different than that, but our role is to deal with uncertainty. And what do I mean by that, right? So when we talk about people or roles within a team, this is my kind of feeling about this, but the idea that product people are dealing with uncertainty. And when I say uncertainty, I mean that we don't know exactly what the future holds. We don't know what's best. We don't know exactly what to do every moment of the day, but we still, in some way, figure it out. And I'd say the same thing happens for user researchers, data scientists, and business development people, right? They're living in this world where there's not exactly an explicit thing that they need to do all the time. So how do you figure that out? But there are people that deal with more certainty, right? And when I talk about more certainty, I mean people that need to actually produce something at some point that exists in the world. And so designers, developers, even sales, and even managers tend to exist in a world that has the type of uncertainty that we deal with as product people at a much lower type of case. And so when we talk about the idea of practices that require more uncertainty, right? At the start of a project, you usually don't know what you need to do. So that idea of how do we figure that out is incredibly important. When we do discovery, when we do ideation, when we're starting a planning meeting, those are all times that are of incredibly high uncertainty. But there's the opposite too. When we're ending a project, we should have a lot of certainty about what we built, right? We should have a lot of certainty during focused work times. Like when we talk about the cycle, and again, I'm not going to prophesize about short cycles like weekly cycles or long cycles like multi-month cycles. But the truth is that at the beginning, you don't really know what you're going to do. During the middle, you should really know what you're trying to do because that's when you're building it. And then at the end, you will in some ways want to be more certain about what you built, but you also want to be uncertain about whether that met what you were trying to do. And so these are times where, when it comes to product managers and it comes to the way that they parse uncertainty, is that we really need to be the people that help interpret the world's uncertainty to the rest of the team. And that's also why I put user researchers up there, is if you do things like generative research, you're going out there and you're trying to understand out of all the possible problems and all the possible people that we could talk to, these are the people that really matter and they're going to help us, you have to help the people on your team understand that world in some way. And so I think that's incredibly key for product people, is to keep that in the back of your mind that you need to be understanding uncertainty. And this mindset doesn't come up specifically right now, but later on I'm going to talk about different types of exercises and workshops that help you increase the uncertainty in ways that feel safe for the rest of your team. So that's for the self, right? When we talk about teams, it starts to get a little bit more interesting. And in particular, one aspect that I think is very important is to add tension to the world. And when I say tension, I don't mean people yelling at each other, right? I don't mean anything super violent, but I do mean kind of the relationship between two people when they're sparring partners. Has anybody here done martial arts or boxing or anything like that? Okay. So if you're not familiar with this, the idea of a sparring partner is someone that is not trying to kill you. They're trying to make you better at what you do, right? And that's your job as a product person, is to be that sparring partner for everybody on your team and to actually, in some ways, create more functional tension within your team so that you can make better decisions, right? So part of all the things I said about diversity, about the idea of certainty assumptions, the moment that everybody thinks the same, that's when you actually have a problem. And so that's why tension is incredibly important to create within teams. And so, when we talk about being challenged and pushed, I like to bring up one example. And so I've submitted my writing to a lot of different places. And these were 4 different things that real people said about my writing, okay? Could do with a bit more imagination, inspiration. At parts, feel a bit pedantic, and there's some profanity we need to remove. It's all substance, no style, and please stop using hyped up topics like AI just as advertisements. So, this didn't feel good when I got some of these things. But it did make me think about, like, why am I doing this, right? Why am I writing? Why am I trying to share these messages with the world? And then maybe, should I stop swearing as much in my writing? I don't know. Those are hard questions to answer. But Gustavo Rossetti, he wrote a post on Medium that I think really kind of made it very succinct in how we should understand feedback, is that really good feedback does hurt. If it didn't hurt, it didn't make our brains think in some way, it would just be what we assumed we were going to understand or what we were going to get. So I think that's something that we need to keep in mind when we talk about how we build this tension into the system, is that it does need to hurt in some ways. But when we talk about, Ando Mierza is a sensei instructor for karate. He talks about it as, as martial artists, we have to make a distinction between hurting and injuring, right? A bad sparring partner is someone who injures you. And so I think this is maybe the distinction I try to make, and maybe it's not as clear to everybody here because they haven't done martial arts or boxing, but the truth is that you're not there to injure the other person. You're there to make sure that they understand something about the way that they do their work. And it's up to them to also be okay with getting hurt in some ways, but to not allow themselves to get injured, right? So it's a two-way street when it comes to a lot of this. And so one of the things that I found to be really powerful for this is what I refer to as critiques. So this is something that designers do, code reviews for engineers. How do we create a space by which we can actually give feedback to each other around the work that we do? Now the problem is that I don't think a lot of product people do this today. And so I wrote a post about this, but what it really comes down to is that product managers do not spend enough time with each other. Right? We're usually on another team somewhere where there's like designers and engineers and data scientists or ops or whatever, but we're not really spending a lot of time with each other, understanding our craft, sharing with each other. And so through critiques, what I've found is that it really starts to get people to understand each other, but also provide a constructive way to provide that feedback. And so the way I've done these, and you can find these instructions online too, but our artifacts, it's not code in our case, it's not a design. Our stuff can sometimes just be an email, right? It can sometimes be a presentation. It can be a document or a PRD if you still write those. It could be a user story, right? It could be acceptance criteria. It could be whatever you're writing as an individual that's really important for you to get feedback from other people. And during that time, it's about transferring practice, right? And it's not just from experienced people to newer people, but it's also, like, how do we do it here? What is the expert way to do this? But it's also, what are the new ways to do this, right? We talk about doctors. The doctor that you probably want is the one that probably just got out of medical school. And the reason why is because they know all of the latest techniques. And they know the old techniques not to use anymore, probably. Anyways, that's what I found. And so in these types of cases, if you have a product team, setting up a time, say, once every other week, where people come in, they present their work, and then they get critique of that work at least once every other week or something like that. You end up getting a lot of transfer of knowledge. You start to see across different experience levels how people do things, and maybe where the deficiencies are, and how to fix them. But what's important is the way that you actually structure this critique. So I have a set of rules that I use for people that are presenting. One is that you should not be selling your work, right? That's not what you're doing here. You're not trying to get people onto your side. What you're trying to do is you're trying to show the work. You're not trying to talk about it as much. If people need to read it, that's fine. And then it's up to you as the presenter to leave with a list that you will then decide whether you want to take into account or not. I think one of the problems that a lot of these feedback sessions end up getting to with product people is that it feels like we have to take on all of the feedback. But it's really up to us to decide what feedback we accept and what feedback we don't accept, right? That's our work that we're talking about. And that's the way it works with a lot of really healthy design critiques as well. The next thing for people that are providing critique, right, is that it is critique and not criticism. It's about the work. It's not about the person. I found that to be incredibly important. And then, I think something that a lot of product people really need to be great at is how do you ask good questions, right? That's your job as a product person, is to ask great questions. And so during this time, I think a lot of people, when they first start seeing this format, they start talking about, hey, you should do this or you should do that. But the reality is that the you should do this is coming from the fact that you have a question about the context that they have considered to build this work. And what they need to do is they need to potentially consider that context as well. And then finally, it's not about what you like or dislike, right? Like I think that's one thing that people get wrong in critiques is that just because you dislike the formatting of my spec or the way that I've written this, it doesn't really matter. Like my opinion or your opinion, they're both opinions, right? And then you shouldn't be solving them in the meeting, right? Just like you don't want to be going after solutions all the time and you want to be understanding problems, producting in the meeting or during a critique session does that basically right there. So that's what I found to be really powerful when it comes to critiques. The next thing, and something I want you to try, is called the pre-mortem. How many people have heard of a pre-mortem before? All right, how many people have actually done a pre-mortem? Okay. So pre-mortems, they come from some work by Gary Klein. And a pre-mortem is really interesting because it's trying to understand, based on all of our intuition, all of our knowledge about the world, how is it that we could fail at something? But to do it in a way that is grounded in kind of reality rather than just worst case scenarios. And so the way that this works is generally you give a prompt to the entire audience. You then do some type of ideation, and I'll talk about what that is. And then you start to look at like what are the reasons that people are thinking that this would fail. And so let's get to the prompt, right? So a prompt would look like this. Imagine we are time in the future. I use 1 year because that's far enough away. And a project has been some type of horrible failure. What's important is that you link it to whatever the stakes are for your team, right? Whatever you actually care about as a team. There have been times I've run these types of pre-mortems where the team really just cared about their reputation within the industry. And so that was really important to talk about. Or losing money, or shutting down the company, or whatever it is, right? But it has to be something that's really horrible. And then it was so bad that it gets even worse, right? So what's worse than whatever the worst thing is you could imagine? And now that you've imagined this failure, please think back today, right? I want you to go in the future, I want you to imagine it happened, and then I want you to come back to today, and I want you to tell me why it happened, okay? And I want to do that as a group. So, a few key terms here if people are not familiar. So, private ideation is maybe something that people may or may not have heard of. How many people have heard of private ideation? Okay, how many people have heard of brainstorming? Okay. Those are very different things. And the reason why they're different things is that brainstorm is usually some person standing up at the whiteboard, the hippo is sitting in their seat and is like, all right, ideas everybody, let's go. And they start writing up a couple ideas. Yeah, exactly.
What would you say hippo stands for?
Oh, sorry, yeah. Highest paid person in the room, basically, right? Or highest something opinion in the room, basically. Yeah. So that's where it usually goes wrong, right? Private ideation, though, is about the fact that because we're all different minds, we are coming at a problem or a question in different ways. And so we'd rather capture all of that before we start priming each other with the way we all individually think. So that's private ideation. It happens silently. So usually people are writing down on Post-it notes or using another tool, something like that, but you're doing it silently. You're not talking to each other. You're not exposing ideas to each other. The next thing is deduplicate. So you can imagine what this means, but generally when there's a good idea or an idea that's part of like the script for the organization, it will come up multiple times. And so we try to collapse those down in some way. And then finally, dot vote, right? When we talk about diverging activities like private ideation, at a certain point you need to you need to converge down, you need to remove uncertainty and decide what to do next. And so I found that setting a criteria for dot voting, and dot voting can happen a lot of different ways. There's people that make tons of money on making little round stickers this big, and they sell them by the spool so that everybody can go up and put a sticker on something. But all you need to have is either like a marker, and you can do it by marking on the little ideas, or you can use another tool to do that, and I'll show you how to do that. So that's kind of the process for a pre-mortem. Now, I would like to do a pre-mortem with you guys right now. Okay. So here's what we're going to do. Let's pretend it's tomorrow, and this meetup has been a total failure. Okay, like an absolute failure. Like so bad, if you see each other out at other product events, you pretend you don't know each other. Okay, it's so bad that like when you see I'm speaking somewhere, you actively boycott it and you tell people not to go. Like you start up social media campaigns where I'm not supposed to be speaking. Okay. And you just hate it so much that you maybe even consider, is product management the right role for me to take on in the world, okay? That's how bad this presentation turns out, okay? And so what I want you to do now, and we're going to use a tool called .voter app, which Yael sent out as part of the email. Go to this URL. It's tinyurl.com/adv for adversarial -PM-PRE. Okay? Now, you do have to log in with either an email address or Google login. If you feel uncomfortable doing that, feel free to abstain out of this process. But when you go up there, what you should see is you should see something like this, but probably on your mobile phone. Okay?
Can you go back to that?
Yeah, sorry. So don't do anything yet. Just sit there for now once you get that up. So this is a tool to do kind of remote private ideation and dot voting. It's something that was built at the last company I was at, but I like it so much that even though I'm not there anymore, I still use it. All right, how many people are in right now? A few? Okay. Great. So here's what we're going to do. I want you to remember this prompt again. Oh. Again, it's tomorrow. This sucked. This sucks so much. You hate everything. And I want you to now come back to right this moment. What are the reasons why it sucked, right? I want you to kind of predict the future a little bit about why it could have sucked, all right? And I want you to do that, and I'm going to give you 2 minutes right now to basically form as many ideas as you can. And so the way to do this in this tool is you just tap on this area, you type in something, and you hit return. And what it will do is it will create a little Post-it note in the list of other Post-it notes, okay? So I'm going to give you 2 minutes to think about this, all right? Create as many ideas as you can, 1 idea per sticky note in this case, okay? So I'll give you 2 minutes. All right, add your last idea, stop adding ideas. And I'll turn off private ideation. All right. All right, so stop adding things. Wow, it's a lot of things, you guys.
You asked for it.
All right, so we'll let, if you guys can stop for a second. Here, actually, let me, I get it. All right, hold on. All right, so a couple things here, right? Bad presentation, that makes sense. Speaker forgot his speech. Everyone's most embarrassing moment was shared publicly. Speaker had no idea he was talking about and was wasted. Wow. I mean, we're not serving booze here today, but his presentation was terrible. No original work, only ideas from other authors. It's kind of turning true already. There was a gas explosion, and the organizers locked the door. It stinks. There was a fire. These are all awesome, horrible ideas. No one showed up. Have a bigger screen for the presentation. So I think like what's really interesting here, though, is that people, when they need to be creative in a negative way, they're really good at it, is I guess what I'm trying to say. And you're all really good at this. You guys did a great job at pulling together. Here we go, some mumbo jumbo. I couldn't understand the speaker. Okay. So what we would usually do next, right, as far as a pre-mortem, is that we'd go through, I just saw Justin Bieber as product manager. I'm much taller than he is. But what we do is we go through, we try to create a single set of kind of mutually exclusive items that we could then go and vote on. But what I'm going to do now is, because I'm flying basically by the seat of my pants at this point, we're going to allow everybody here. I'm going to give you 3 minutes. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you, I'll give you 10 votes each, okay? And what I want you to do is I want you to go in there and I want you to vote for the things that are most likely to cause a problem for this particular meetup. So I want you to apply what you know right now. And the way you do that, by the way, is just down at the bottom here. If you click the bottom, you can, turns into a little crosshair. If you want to remove it, you just mouse over it again. And so I want you to let's take a few minutes right now. I want you to read through them on your own. You won't get to all of them, but that's okay. Some people start from the bottom, some people start from the top. And I want you to start to vote on what are the reasons why you think this particular meetup really sucked, okay? And I'll give you 3 minutes to do this. All right, last 10 seconds. Let's finish up. All right, I'm going to close the board and sort the votes in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, so let's see what we got here. Someone was really rude and disruptive. I mean, how many times have people been at meetups where there was that one person that kept asking literally like questions a lot that were not helpful to the rest of the group, right? I mean, makes sense. No original work, only ideas from other authors. Okay, all right. We don't learn any ways to overcome biases. Yeah, That's a real concern, right? Turns out he doesn't know what he's talking about. Let's not play into my own self-doubt right now, but, and the networking was horrible. So basically, like, from the point of view of a pre-mortem now, what you would do is you would look at the things the team was most concerned about and they thought was most likely to happen. And we would then assign these to individuals to not only think about, like, what are some ways to process this and maybe do something about it, but we'd also take this and then we would bring this to our first meeting that we had as a team, the next meeting. And you want to try to address these on a regular basis. As a product manager, I would try to keep this list and just see which things were actually possibly happening. So I found the pre-mortem to be, yeah, question.
Is this, I've never done this kind of an exercise before.
Yeah.
It seems pretty cool. It sounds to me, correct me if I'm wrong, you're trying to predict what are the things that are most likely to go wrong.
That's right. Yeah, and you're trying to use the intuition of the entire group, right? But you're also trying to, you're using a couple different mindsets here. One is like our intuition as based on all the projects that we have all collectively done, or in this case, all of the meetups we've ever gone to, collectively we built an intuition about this, right? The second thing is that we're having people be very creative in a negative way, right? Which is something that people love doing, right? People love being creative in a negative way. And then finally, we're using group consensus to decide what actually matters to us and what we're concerned about. And then I guess maybe one other thing is just the idea of private ideation in this case is that rather than, like, the worst types of pre-mortems are when, again, the manager gets up and says, all right, everybody, tell me what your worst fears are. And it's like, I don't want to tell you what my worst fears are. That's uncomfortable, right? Like, if I tell you that my worst fear is that you are not doing a good job managing this team, how is that supposed to work? So there's a lot of bad ways to do pre-mortems. And so I found that this process, so we did this on a very large team. When I was at Philosophy, which is a design consultancy, we were effectively running a scrum of scrums, which, but basically the 5 other consultancies that we were working with, we were the ones that seemed to have the most product sense out of everybody. And so we ran this type of exercise. And we found things like team communication, trust between teams, different definitions of the same term. Those were all things that were voted incredibly highly and were definitely problems that we had. So I would just say, like, overall, like, the crowd is right about a lot of this stuff. So that's where I found it really helpful. Yeah, any other questions before we move on? But I definitely recommend this. Yeah?
So going back to your earlier point where you said if the group is the same and everyone thinks in the same
Yeah.
direction, like, how do you avoid that?
Yeah.
Right? Like, where everyone is just saying the same things, but
That's
those
right.
aren't actually your issues.
Well, here's what I'd say is that there is enough variance even in less diverse teams, like when we talk about like mindsets, people, whatever, right? Even in less diverse teams, there's still the mental state that you're all in right now. And there's still the history that you have as individuals that is really, really important in this case. And so that's why, again, we do private ideation is we don't want to prime each other with like all of us suddenly agreeing that there's this one thing. What we want to do is we want to get all of the ideas out on paper or digitally. We want to get them out of us. And then we start discussing what are the pros and cons of these different issues. So that's why, even when it is incredibly similar, like in all honesty, I've never been on a team where everybody could recite the strategy of the company, okay? So I guess that's my point, is that there's still humongous amounts of variability within any team. Yeah, is that fair? Yeah.
Is this something that you recommend doing at different stages of the product development process?
Yeah, this is a great question. Yeah, I found personally that you can do this on like a wide group point of view, like the entire company doing something like at a retreat. I think that's a good time. Like if you're trying to rethink things, this is a good time to do that, right? And so when there's high uncertainty, right? Beginning of a project, the kickoff of a new team, the relaunching of like a decision-making process, those are all appropriate times to do this. So I'd say anytime that you have a high amount of uncertainty, this is a good way to kind of figure out where things will go wrong with this uncertainty.
I've done actually a
Yeah.
similar kind
Yeah.
of exercise at, okay, we've finished building what we think is the MVP of this
Yeah.
thing. We're about to launch it for the very first time.
Yeah.
And we had a similar,
Oh, yeah.
it wasn't like a private idea.
Sure.
Kind of way. It was more of, let's
Well,
talk about what's the worst things that could happen. when
That's
we
fair.
launch this.
Well, this is a lot. I mean, one of the things that I've, I guess, been following for a while that feeds into all of the reason why I think about this is chaos monkeying and chaos engineering, right? So that idea of how are you using the assumption of worst case and how are you kind of like using the variability of the environment to help you discover problems, right? And so I think it's very much that type of thing. And so that's why that idea of like a game day in chaos engineering is very much like, what are all the different ways we could think about screwing up the system? And that's like a really helpful way too. Slightly different though for product people, is all I'd say. Yeah, you got a question?
Yeah, it's very similar to lean coffee.
Yeah, lean coffee is great too, yeah.
Do you consider to discuss all this after?
Yeah, so when we get the top things, essentially, yeah, you usually will have a small discussion. You can do it in a lean coffee format. If people are not familiar with lean coffee, it's essentially where if you don't have, this is a great hack for product people. If you're going into a meeting and you have no idea what you're going to talk about with your team, basically, what you should have an agenda, okay, just to be clear. But in the case that you're really busy and that you're going meeting to meeting, you want to go into a meeting, what you do is you take a minute and everybody writes down the things that are big concerns to them or problems or things they want to talk about. And everybody lays them out, they present them as like individual stickies, and then everybody votes on the things that they think that are most important. And in all honesty, like when I do group product meetings, I would say the rotation of meetings that I do, one meeting is a critique, the next meeting is a lean coffee, the next meeting is a learning presentation. And so you cycle through those every week, and you gain a lot of understanding of not just, hey, we're improving our team, we're improving each other in our practice, we're learning about the things that people care about. So that's what a lean coffee is, and I find lean coffee to be really effective. This is like that an awful lot, right? But the thing that's different about this is that a lean coffee is more open-ended, right? It's more about the framing that we're providing in that case is just, say, in the case of the group product management type of meeting is like, what are we concerned about as product managers right now, right? Like it's just whatever it could be. So it's pretty broad. In this case, we're specifically using negative mindsets, the idea of future thinking, the idea of looking backwards, like a bunch of different things that we're using to create the mindset that then effectively pulls out our intuition. That if I just asked you for your intuition, it'd be very hard for you to just say what that intuition was, right? It's a way to, I think this is like a really interesting mechanism when we talk about talking to customers too, is that it's not that they want to lie to you, it's that they don't know all the time their truth, right? And I'll get to that in a second. But anyways, that's the reason why I do this. Any other questions before we move on? Or? All right, great. Well, you guys did a great job. Give yourselves a round of applause. Good job on the pre-mortem. I'm just going to write down a few of these issues to make sure. I can't change my presentation at this point, though. I'm sorry, everybody. So let's get back. So that's a pre-mortem. Oh, and I didn't do this, but so the next thing is randomize, okay? Randomization is the next mindset that I think is really, really powerful for product people, especially if you need to increase uncertainty and you need to consider more. And so where does this come from, right? When we talk about randomness in itself, just by itself, is basically garbage, right? This is static. It's the most random thing you can probably have, right? We talk about randomness, entropy, things like that. They're not interesting in some way. And the reason why that randomness is not interesting is because it doesn't involve humans. And then here's another type of randomness. So this is a survey where they asked people to pick a random number. It's clearly not random, right? And the reason why is because we're biased in some way. Like we can't think of real randomness. Like a great story about this is poker players, right? When poker players consider bluffing, some poker players, not all of them, they'll look at their watch face. And if the second hand is in the bottom half of the watch, they'll bluff. And if it's the top part, they won't. The reason why is it adds this level of total uncertainty about whether am I bluffing or not because I'm not even making that choice anymore, right? And so humans are bad at randomness. Machines, the universe is really good at randomness. I'm not going to get into the specifics about how true causation works and everything like that, but let's just say that the universe is pretty random, okay? And what really inspired me is something from Kenneth Stanley's work, he's now the head of Uber's AI lab. But he created something that's called PickBreeder, okay? And PickBreeder basically was to show off this new algorithm that he called novelty-based search. And so these are all pictures that were generated through a very particular mechanism. The first mechanism was that it was something we refer to as a genetic algorithm. So it's where an algorithm, in this case, it would basically create some art. It all started off as black and white, but then evolved color over time. But essentially what happened is it was an algorithm that would create a piece of art, and then people would pick which pieces of art they thought were most interesting, and then it would breed that piece of art with some children, and to create a bunch of children that would have some randomization, some relatedness. But over time, you would see evolution from a very simplistic thing to a very complex thing. And the only fitness function, or the only function that was actually pushing this evolution process forward, was human beings. And so what's interesting is that at a certain point, it got to these really, really complicated images. And when you look at some of these images and the history or the ancestors of these images, it doesn't make very much sense, right? Like for this skull, who would have thought that something that looks kind of like a drop in a water would turn into that eventually? And the people that were playing this game didn't know that either. Well, all they were doing is they were applying essentially a human fitness function on top of something that was completely random to create something that was pretty amazing for an algorithm to create. And this is related to something that I did a little while ago. So I think where this really drove the point home for me is I was working for a group out of Hong Kong. And we did a hackathon with a university group in Shantou, Guangdong, China. And what we did is we took a bunch of engineers and a bunch of art students, and we randomly assigned them to groups, which they were incredibly pissed off about, apparently. They did not voice that to me in English, but they were really upset about that. And then we basically took, so game jams are these things where you create like a random theme, and then everybody has to create a game that is based on that theme. And so what we did is we created a spreadsheet where I had, I think it was a famous person, it was a art style, and then we included some engineering mechanisms like there's some Arduino Grove devices that had a sensor or a button or something like that, and then some type of automated mechanism like a motor or something else. So anyways, it's like this spreadsheet that I created that would randomize essentially all these different things, art, style, a person, mechanisms all together. And what they had to do, because I really remember fondly creating dioramas when I was in school, everybody had to create a diorama out of this. And so what's really, really amazing about this is that we had no idea what was going to come out of this process, right? And what did come out of this was Steve Jobs playing ping pong on the beach in the style of Baroque. And it had a motion sensor, and it would actually move whenever you moved your hand over it, right? And this was done in 24 hours. But it was something that we could never imagine would ever occur in this universe, basically, until we had randomly created it. And all I did was create the engine that created the random concept. It was these artists and these engineers that created the incredibly impressive thing that we have here. And there were a bunch of teams that did this, right? So for me, that randomness, it really stuck in my head that it was interesting and important to try to apply more randomness to the things that I do in my daily life. And so one of those things, when we think about why this works, right? Generally, we have some type of prompt, right? We have a problem, we have a how might we have something that is driving us to solve some type of thing or do something in this world. We take all of the mindsets of different people that are on that team, and that's why there's the little X. Sorry, this is the second equation, by the way. And it's totally fake. There's no scientific background on this. This is just something I think of. And we apply some type of random seed to it. We actually end up getting a lot of really interesting ideas. And the reason why is because it's not pure randomness, right? It's randomness joined with the ability for human beings to actually want something from this world. And that's incredibly important. So this is something that was pretty fortuitous and very random, actually. But Vera Molnar, she's a very, very early computer artist. She's based out of France. And so there's what she was saying about randomness is that there's a thing that can replicate intuition, and it's randomness. It will show you the billions of possibilities of which, with your limited imagination, you couldn't have thought of. So when we look at all the problems we have with assumptions, when we look at all the problems with biases, the blind spot bias, the way for us to actually understand the rest of the universe, to be able to, in some way, actually utilize it, is for us to embrace this idea of randomness in all of the processes that we do. And so I'm going to talk about one in particular, though. And so this is ideation with randomness. There's a couple different ways that I've done this. We're going to do a very kind of simple version of this. But the way that this first got started is I have like 5 decks of cards here. I usually only carry 2 or 3 decks of cards around with me. But the one that I have here is called Oblique Strategies. Okay? And Oblique Strategies was created by Brian Eno and Peter Schmidt. And so Brian Eno, musician, Peter Schmidt, writer, they would find that when they were in the studios, and you know, Brian Eno, if you're not familiar with who he is, I mean, he's done amazing work with like, David Bowie, a bunch of different people, right? There's lots of people. Anyways, he's a great musician. It's what? U2, exactly. There's a lot of amazing acts that he's worked with. And so what he did, though, is he found that when people have this block where they're not able to create music anymore, what they do is he would ask them a bunch of weird questions, basically. And so he started creating this list of weird questions. And he came up with about 60 weird questions. And I have the box of the cards here. They're not cheap for some reason. I don't think they need to make. You can actually get a free app online that does the same thing. But what's really key is that these are prompts that are meant to make you reconsider the way the world is working in some way. So just choosing randomly here. Oh, I got the deck card. Sorry, not that one. So one of them right now is just carry on. Right? Try faking it. Use an unacceptable color with a U because he's British. Remember those quiet evenings. Is there something missing? Make something implied more definite. Reinforce and duplicate. So these things, they don't make a lot of sense with me just reading them out loud right now, right? They don't. But what we would use them for is we would do this process called crazy eights at philosophy. Sorry, yeah, so Brian Eno, what he would say about this, because it would break you out of your rut. It would push you into a kind of behavior that you normally wouldn't make. And sometimes that was very productive. And you notice that he says sometimes. So I want to make sure that it's very clear that this stuff works very well over the long haul. And I would say almost every single session that I've done these things, it has produced a new insight that I wouldn't have gotten otherwise. But it doesn't do it every single thing. Okay, that just want to make sure that's clear. So this is what's called the crazy eight. All right, this is actually my handwriting. I can't even read most of this anymore. But it's basically where you take a sheet of paper, you divide it into 8 sections by folding it, and then for each one of those sections, you draw a sketch in 1 minute, and you do it over 8 minutes. And now what we started to do with Crazy Eights was that we started drawing a card from Oblique Strategies for every one of these frames. And what we started to find was that it was no longer we were just like iterating over and over and over again on the same concept in each one of those frames and kind of like small embellishments on it. We started coming up with like vastly different ideas for each one of those frames. And when you're trying to come up with like the highest breadth of ideas as possible, this is a really good thing. So here's an example of where we started, we had the card deck there, and then we started collecting for each one of these sketches, there was a different card that we drew. So the first one, we don't actually draw any card. It's just like, what do you think, based on this problem, what do you think you need to do? Second one was, don't stress one thing more than another. What mistakes did you make last time? I've gotten things like courage, exclamation point, which no one knows how to interpret. But, and then the 8th one, a lot of the time what I'll do just to maybe tie back into the bad idea, I actually ask on the 8th one, what is a bad idea we could sketch right now? So a combination of these things, this idea of like randomness, opposites, they're causing people to really think about the edges of the problem space and the solution space that they're trying to consider. So now you are all going to try this. What I would like to do, and maybe this is a little bit selfish of me, I would like to understand how you might use adversarial thinking in your practice today. So based on everything I've told you so far, based on the mindsets I've talked about, I want you to come up with a few examples, okay, of adversarial models. So go to this URL again. Promise you don't have to log in twice, I don't think. So it's adv-pm-idea. Okay, I'll give you guys a second to get there. Great. So here's what we're going to do, is I want you to come up with some ideas on how you might use adversarial thinking in your day-to-day. And to inspire you, I brought a different card deck that I use, which it's the Sun Tzu's Art of War on playing cards. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I want you to first basically start putting in ideas. Okay, so I want you to just like, let's all put in one idea right now. What's a way so far that you can think about putting in an adversarial, using adversarial in your day-to-day? Like tomorrow, what would be something that you could do tomorrow during a meeting that would help you in some way with the adversarial model? So think about that. Here, I'll shuffle the cards while you do that. So let's choose a card. So now I want you to come up with something, but I want you to base it off of this card. This card says, allow your adversary no sanctuary. Strategy, threaten your adversary everywhere and all the time. Basis, the presence of your constant threat impedes your adversary's preparation and recovery. What would that mean to you in your day-to-day, your day tomorrow? What do you have to do that would allow your adversary no sanctuary? What does that mean? What does that mean to you? So it's like a free association type of thing, right? It's this based on your context, and then write down that idea. And I'll give you a minute to do that.
that one more time?
Yeah, sure. It is allow your adversary no sanctuary. Threaten your adversary everywhere and all the time. The presence of your constant threat impedes your adversary's preparations and recovery. Okay, here we're gonna do one more because I know we're short on time right now. So here's the next prompt. Sacrifice a nickel for a dollar. Sacrifice a small loss to prevent a large loss. Preserving your resources safeguards your capacity to operate. What does that mean in your context using adversarial thinking in your day tomorrow? Sacrifice a nickel for a dollar. All right, we'll do one more. The next one is lie in wait for an attacking adversary. Challenge your adversary's plans with an aggressive defense that is prepared to receive them. An adversary that attacks your defense as you've prepared it to receive him maximizes your advantages. Lie in wait for an attacking adversary. What would that mean in your context for adversarial thinking tomorrow? Yeah, sure. Sorry. Lie in wait for an attacking adversary. Challenge your adversary's plans with an aggressive defense that is prepared to receive them. How would you do that? And so I guess all I'm saying here is that, so skip lunch to meet a release deadline, take a product idea off the roadmap for take a product idea of the roadmap for a bad idea, kill off a feature used by a few users who love it in order to build something for more users, invest in yourself, get rid of the thing pulling everyone else down before someone good leaves. Right, so these are all things that, based on my experience at least, while it may seem like it's really simple, but it changed the way that people were thinking about the prompt that I gave them. And it created more variance in the responses that were here. Any questions about this? How did that feel for people? Was that hard? Yeah? Okay.
Just talk a little. I'm having trouble understanding how you would use this in a real life scenario with a team.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've done, so besides the crazy eights, which is where basically crazy eights are used to consider a lot of different thoughts when you're trying to come up with a breadth of ideas for a solution, right? One of the other ways I've used this is that we were trying to, on a particular project, we were looking to create, basically we were building out innovative, like emerging tech type of things. And so we wanted to understand, like, what would it mean to have special prediction capability in this particular domain? And so what we did is we started drawing cards that would say, okay, let's talk, like I have a deck of cards here that is focused on like user-centric questions, right? So trying to consider what would it mean for you to actually help an end user in a particular way, right? Well, so what you're trying to do is you're trying to say, these questions are adding additional ways to think about the problem. And so anytime that you're trying to generate more ideas, I think is really important. But then I also, from the standpoint of when you're trying to understand whether you did the right thing, asking a bunch of these questions helps you understand, did you actually ask the right questions too?
What's the end result that you're looking to achieve with these exercises?
So two things. One, more ideas, right? Or better answer. To build, like say you wanted to build like a new feature. Like what are all the different ways you could build a new feature? That would be where all these ideas go. But then the second thing is that you're actually building alignment between all the teammates in how people think and what they're considering. So you're getting like the activity of doing these types of exercises together, trying to think about the kind of like edges of the way you consider the world. Those are all things that as a team, you actually grow closer and better at understanding each other in some way. So those are the different types of aspects of that. Yeah, what other questions?
That last one made a lot of sense.
Is that better? Okay, cool. Thank you. I appreciate that. So yeah, so that's basically doing ideation with randomness. Because we don't have a lot of time, we're not going to dot vote any of these. But the next thing is customers. Okay, so when we talk about adversarial mindsets for customers, this is really related to the idea or the mindset of the skeptic. And when we talk about skepticism, this goes back to, again, this design consultancy, right? We would get a lot of people that would come in and say, I want to build Facebook for yoga. And I'd be there listening to them and be like, isn't Facebook already Facebook for yoga? And the problem there was that they were coming from a very particular point where they had come up with the solution. And they had assumed what the solution was for whatever problem they either had or didn't have in their mind. And so being a skeptic helped me in some way by not just suddenly saying, yes, this solution is the right thing. Now, there's techniques in how you soften the blow of like being skeptical, but I think that's really important. You need to be skeptical whenever someone feels like they have the right goal, the actual right solution. And they are also suffering from this fact that they are wrong, but they don't know how yet. And so surprise is really, really important when learning new things, right? So just like feedback when it hurts is because it's surprising. When we talk about learning things from customers, what you're trying to optimize for is actually surprise from the standpoint of that it's not just what you think is true. Because if it's what you think is true, then everything you're doing is probably right, and why are you even talking to them, right? You're trying to optimize for what you don't know at that point. And so one of the ways that this really works well is something called discursive prototypes. And so if people haven't heard about this, I've also seen people call it provocative prototyping. But it's essentially when you build a prototype and then you show it to someone and say a user test, you do something like this. And so this is supposed to be a healthcare site, okay? It's using Comic Sans, lots of ugly colors, like horrible iconography. It's supposed to be a really serious site, right? This is supposed to be about my medical care. But what they did is they put together a prototype that was outrageous and ridiculous, and they showed it to people. And they showed it to them in a very straight-faced way. What do you think about this? And what they understood was that the things that they thought that would matter to these people really didn't matter. And so from the standpoint, right, discursive prototypes work exactly like that. It's an intervention, right? It intervenes expectations and models of thinkings by investigating possible future scenarios and new concepts or problematic side effects of existing services. And so the way I interpret this is that essentially, I'm showing you this provocative prototype because I don't actually know what matters to you. I don't know what is bad. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to build the thing that I think would be bad for you. And so again, you hear the same thing of I'm skeptical that people actually know what they want, and I'm trying to do the opposite of what I think is right. And so those two mindsets together really create this idea of a discursive prototype. The next one is calling them on it. And when I say, I probably should put this in quotes, but one of the things that I've found really troublesome or hard to pin down when it comes to product management decision making is things like pricing and then whether someone will actually buy my product or not, right? It's very hard to ask someone a question like, oh, hey, do you want to buy this product? And they'll say, yeah, sure, I guess so. So what I've done, and you know, I wonder whether people are going to feel good or bad about this, but I would say to them at the end of my user test, I'd say, thank you for answering questions about your interest in buying our new service. Since you said you would be willing to can you please sign this credit card authorization form? I promise we will not charge you until our service is available. And so it is definitely a deception, right? Most user research is actually about deception, just by the way. But what's interesting is that it's calling them on some bluff about that, yes, I would buy this. And if you see hesitation, of course, you're not pressuring them in any way. But what's really interesting about that hesitation is that probably the information they gave you is not really true. Same thing with, would you recommend this to other people, right? If they say yes, say, oh, well, that'd be great. Do you mind calling someone right now that you could recommend this to? And see if they hesitate. Now, I usually don't make them go all the way through it, because there's actually a lot of PCI compliance issues with this. But it helps to be skeptical, right, with your customers. Because it's not that they don't know, and it's not that they're actively lying to you. It's just that they have models and perceptions that are maybe not as closely aligned to reality as they'd like to think. And then finally, when we talk about customers, this idea of surprise for synthesis, right? So as part of the work I've been doing, I used to do around user research, you know, we started to think about this idea, it really is like a Venn diagram, because everything that's really important gets boiled down to a Venn diagram, of course. So what do we know? And that's what we go into a user research study with, is what we know. We then go out and ask a bunch of questions, and we learn a bunch of other stuff where there's some overlap. What's interesting, or what's not interesting, is actually the no surprise zone, right? So these are the things that we already knew and we verified in some way, and that's really not surprising. And actually, frankly, that's not, whenever we would report back to people, that's not what they cared about. They would tell us that if we filled our report with everything that we already knew that we verified, it was less interesting. The stuff that we do know but we weren't able to actually see during the user testing is unverified. And so that is, what's interesting about that component is that it could be where we have biases or assumptions about the world that are not true. And so we should be thinking about that. And then the next thing is that all of this stuff out here that we learn, that's the surprise. That's the really, really important stuff about user research. So I think that idea of being skeptical that just the regular stuff that you're going to do, like you're just going to ask people and they're going to tell you that's going to work out that way, you should be skeptical of that. And if a user research session goes that way, it's bad in some way.
Would you say that the unverified can also somewhat be a surprise zone?
Yeah, it could be, definitely. And I think more than anything, it's what are we learning about the stuff that we didn't have any idea about that people really care about the most? But yeah, to your point, it is surprising when we think that something's super important to someone, but they don't talk about it at all, right? That's an assumption we have that's incorrect in some way. So that's really important. So the universe, the last aspect that we have to worry about. And this is where I think reframing really comes in. And so what's interesting about reframing, this is from an HBR article, but it's this idea that the elevator is too slow, and so make the elevator faster is the thing that most people would think about. But of course, the wait is actually annoying, so let's put a mirror everywhere. Right? And so that allowed people to look at themselves while they're waiting for the elevator, right? So that idea of reframing the solution in another way, I think is really interesting. But what I think is most important about reframing when we talk about it as a mindset is it's more about how are we understanding what is important again. And so Derrick Silver's, people who never heard of him, he did CD Baby and wrote a book, wrote a lot of online content, but he's talking about when he was being trained as a musician. And what he would say there is that his teacher said, he'd make me sing at twice as fast, then twice as slow, then like Bob Dylan, then like Tom Watts. Then he'd tell me to sing like it's 4 a.m. and a friend woke me up. Then he'd give me many other scenarios, right? And what was really interesting about this is that realizing the initial choice you made was just one of the many, right? So whatever framing you currently have is just a frame. It's not the frame. It's really important. And so Ankur, who's from Hop Labs, he does something that he calls kind of world warps. And so this idea of applying random constraints to your framing is a really, really interesting one. So if I were to tell you that you only had a weekend to deploy, what would you do about that? What if you had no technical resources and you had to fake all of this? Like, what would that mean for your solution? What if I only gave you, $1 million is a good amount, so I wouldn't say that's necessarily hard. But like this idea of all these things that you can, if you randomly apply constraints, you're again getting at the edges of what really matters to you and what matters to the solution at hand. And then finally, something I call the product reading. And where this comes from, this is a really great article about the idea of the I Ching, which if people are not familiar with the I Ching, it's a kind of ancient, Eastern Asian fortune-telling capability. It's used by flipping a bunch of coins and then creating a particular hex that you then read the fortune for. Now, what's interesting about this, and this person really studied it a lot, was not so much about the mysticism, right? I'm not a very spiritual person, but what was interesting to him was the idea of the I Ching prompting me to go beyond false certainties and to create new and unexpected possibilities. So the concept of that, the framings we have are actually in some way constrained by what we believe or understand today. By taking something that is even possibly mystic in some way, like gambling, when we look at the history of gambling, when we look at the history of fortune telling, it was really a decision-making capability, right? It was helping people that had a lot of uncertainty in the world make a better decision right now, even though it was maybe potentially under fairly random circumstances. And so the last thing that I will kind of throw out there as something I've done previously, and I'm happy to do it here as well, is this idea of using tarot as a way to interpret the framing that you have for your product. I'm not going to do it right now. We don't have time to do a full product reading. And I charge $500 a reading. But basically, the reason why you do this, right, is that there's a lot of symbolism that's used in tarot cards that if you look at, say, this is a five like cross type of setting, right? If I take these and I talk to you about the fact, how is it that you're looking at the present of your product through this symbolism, the question you have, the past of your product, the potential of your product, and the future of your product, how does the symbolism of these different cards, how does that make you change the way you feel or understand your current framing of the product? So again, I'm not a mystic, I'm not like a fortune teller, but this idea of randomness, reframing, the concepts of even trying to understand what is really important to you, this helps you re-understand the framing that you've applied. So, in closing, I want to talk about really briefly what adversarial is not, though. right? So I've talked to you about a lot of mindsets. I've talked to you about a lot of different types of like exercises that you can do. But it's not meant to be mean. It's not meant to actually hurt people. It's not just saying no. I think that's something that I've seen recently, that people are saying, product people are about saying no. That's not the case, right? Adversarial thinking is not about saying no. It's not about being accusatory either. It's not the end goal. Like, being adversarial is actually just a part of the method or the process for you as product people to ask better questions. It's not easy and it's not for everyone, right? So that's the great thing about the spectrum of people that are on your team, is that some people are going to be good at this type of thing and some people are not. But I've found that it makes my practice way more efficient, a lot more astute. And in the end, you know, you're basically making your product better by making sure that it is in some way tested. So these are the 6 different mindsets. Again, take the opposite, randomize, add tension, be uncertain, be skeptical, and reframe. I'll let everybody take a picture of that. My Twitter handle's in the bottom right-hand corner if you want to tweet it out. And I'm going to leave you with 3 quotes from 3 strategists, basically. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win, by Sun Tzu. The second one is by John Boyd, who is he basically is the great, the proto-lean build, measure, learn loop, OODA, observe, orient, decide, act. He created that. And what he said is that in many things that I do, I will set up an adversarial relationship. Not that I do not like the guy. That is not the point, because it sharpens me. And then finally, Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And in closing, if you are interested in getting the slides, I realize that Prime is for the people that are actually interested in this conversation, so it will make my survey better. But please do go and give me feedback. I want to know how I'm wrong, how this is ridiculous, and if I actually lived up to any of the pre-mortem problems that we were discussing. So thank you very much.